Hey Agile friends, welcome to a special series of episodes where we explore product development of a real-life application that enables remote pairing. In this first-person account of product development and remote work stories, we talk about Tuple, a remote pair programming app for macOS and Windows designed to make you feel like you're collaborating in person. If you want to know more, check out Tuple.app/Scrum. That's Tuple.app/Scrum. And let them know you heard about them here on the podcast. For me, what's cool about these stories is how they took the user's needs to heart and put on loads of developer-specific touches you just don't see with generic screen sharing tools. Tuple has been adopted by some very large companies and public sector, more on that in the episodes this week, that work even partially remote, partially or fully, of course. So check out the app at Tuple.app/Scrum and get their 50% off for the first 3 months of your subscription. That's 50% off for the first 3 months of your subscription. Let them know that you heard about Tuple here on the podcast by going to Tuple.app/Scrum. One more time, Tuple.app/Scrum. And now, on to the episode. Hello, everybody. Welcome to a very special bonus episode. For this bonus episode, we have with us Antony Marcano. Hey, Antony. Welcome to the show.
Hey, Vasco. How are you?
All good, all good. So we're going to talk with Antony about how to make remote work for software teams. Antony is a co-founder of RiverGlide and head of engineering at Fort Digital with about 30 years of software development experience, including 25 with Agile practices. He's a respected leader, coach, consultant, and he contributed to books, journals, and he's a keynote speaker at global conferences and also at universities like Oxford in the UK and McGill in Canada. Antony is also the co-creator of Pair With Us. Check out the link on the show notes, and remains a hands-on technical practitioner and coach, specializing in Agile development while leading teams that excel in agility. And we're going to talk all about teams here today, Antony. To get us started, do you remember your first fully remote software project? How did that go?
Yeah, I mean, I think most of us were very much in the camp of working in person as much as possible. We had our physical whiteboards, XP teams sat with their customers, all of that stuff. And then a significant global event occurred that meant that everyone had to work from home, no matter what. And that was really the first time I would say it was fully remote. I'd worked in teams where we had hybrid arrangements where some of us worked from home sometimes, some of us came to the office, but never fully remote. And that was around pretty much about 6 months to a year of just constantly at home with remote working. And what was interesting about that was that particular company, who was a client of mine at the time that I was doing most of my work with, they were not really prepared for it. Yes, they had some people working from home, but they were still using, your conventional video conferencing tools, that sort of thing. And it just doesn't really work for things like pair programming or mob programming when you're working in a highly collaborative team. So yeah, 2020 was the first time a fully remote team. However, I did have experience with certain tools before that. I'll mention a defunct tool now called Screen Hero that was kind of bought up by Slack and then went away and disappeared into the midst, never to be seen again. I used that for a while with a couple of people that I worked with occasionally remotely back in the sort of, many years ago. But that was just occasional. This was a situation where the company was very, very specific about what tools you were allowed to use and not allowed to use. And believe me, they were not ideal.
I can totally sympathize with that. Many of us are, of course, these days familiar with Zoom, which kind of took off at that time, or even Slack has now a remote conferencing facility, Microsoft Teams. But I guess most people don't remember Microsoft Lync or Citrix or even, God forbid, Skype for Business, which were tools that, my God, you might as well come to my office and stick a few forks in my eyes and it will still be more comfortable than using those tools, right? But you did mention something specific here, Antony, that I want to kind of dig into a little bit more. So of course there was this big change, right? Like from working co-located to kind of fully working remote, and that has its own challenges. But you were also trying to at the same time pair or even doing ensemble or mob programming with, you know, several people at the same time. I bet that also brought some weird and wonderful challenges given the tools that were available at the time.
100%. We were quite fortunate that the team that we had been established for about 18 months, no, about a year, and had built up some really good relationships. We were pair programming by default. That's just what people did in the team. Sometimes we'd form ensembles or mobs in order to either solidify certain practices that we decided to adopt that were new and fresh, but we wanted a consistent way of doing it. So we'd reduce the work in progress, get more people working together, solidify the practices, and then start dividing up again. So the team was very well used to it, but mostly in person. The trouble with a lot of the key tools that, you know, your video conferencing tools, they're what I call them passive rather than interactive. You essentially can see each other and talk to each other, but you can't interact with each other's screens very easily. Now, some of the tools allow you to do it, but there tends to be some sort of like request and acceptance. And then while you're interacting with their screen, no one else can do anything else. They have to wait for you to then hand back control. And that just wasn't really working for us. So what we did instead is we just said, right, we're going to accept the limitations of the tools at the time. We weren't able at the time to adopt anything better. And we ended up using a command line utility called Remote Mob Programming /mob. So if you search that, you'll find it on GitHub. And that allows you to use a simple command line to start a session, and you can hand the code across to each other in whatever state it is, because it creates a temporary branch behind the scenes, pushes that branch, and then when the person who continues says mob starts, then it pulls that branch, and then they're ready to carry on and pick up from where you left off. Unfortunately, that process was reasonably quick. One of the difficulties with that, of course, is you really have to have the discipline of making sure that you do that on a regular basis. Otherwise, what you can have is you have one person who's driving all the time and no one else can do anything. They can speak, but they can't actually get their hands on the keyboard and contribute. And that can result in people becoming quite disengaged and disinterested, and they start looking at their phones and so on. So we made that work for a while, and it just, again, wasn't ideal. The teams I work with today tend to be primarily remote, but still hybrid. So still have a little bit in the time co-located, but that tends to be used for in-person workshops and things like that, rather than pair programming or ensemble programming time. So most of the time when the teams that I work with are working remotely, we actually need to use better tools than that. Fortunately, we are currently using Tuple in several of the teams that I look after, who I know is sponsoring today's show. And that's proven very, very handy because it allows you, it's an interactive experience. I can interact with your screen and the control can pass between us seamlessly. It's equivalent to us sitting together, having our own mouse and keyboard plugged into a single computer and working just like the good old days of co-located pair programming. So that, to me, I think is like the essential baseline for any tool that where a team is working remotely in this day and age, certainly for pair programming. I can't hear you at the moment.
And we'll put the link on the show notes to those tools that you mentioned. One of the things that I was thinking about is that, of course, there's the technical challenges you just mentioned, like, you know, difficulty of setting up like this shared control of the screen and so on, working as if we were indeed having only one keyboard and one mouse. But there are also other challenges, right? Like when you're working fully distributed, the communication is harder. It's a lot harder to get what many years ago was called osmotic communication, right? Stuff that you learn just by hearing other people talking around you. What were some of the biggest challenges when it comes to software development and architecture that you face in remote work environment?
I think you've actually hit what I think is the biggest challenge that I don't know if it's really solved yet. And you talked about osmotic communication, but there's another element, which is serendipity. I can be walking along past someone's desk on my way to the water cooler, overhear them talking with the person they're pairing with about a problem that they're struggling with. It could turn out that I had that problem 2 days ago, and I can just walk over to them and say, hey, I had that problem too. I know how to fix it. Would you like me to show you what I had to do? And then we can immediately get them unstuck in that sort of serendipitous way. There's also the water cooler conversations themselves, where you're at the water cooler, or you're making a cup of coffee and someone comes along, maybe you haven't met them before, and you say, oh, hi, how are you? Oh, I'm okay. Oh, what's your name? What team do you work in? Oh, I work in this team. And suddenly you start hearing about things that you wouldn't hear about, and you start having ideas that you wouldn't otherwise have had if you hadn't had that conversation. And there's actually someone called Daniel Rasmus who talks about this idea of the serendipity economy. And he talks about how, the knowledge economy still thinks of how innovation happens in industrial terms, like more like a production line, but that's not how real innovation actually happens. Much of innovation happens largely by accident because of a series of, fortunate events that lead to a particular moment that spark an idea. And sometimes that can be a conversation at the water cooler. And that's one of the things that I think is harder when you're working remotely, but it's not impossible to address. Like because this is something that's quite close to my heart, and I feel quite strongly about this idea of serendipity. It's one of my favorite words because I think it sounds nice and it has a nice meaning. The idea of something fortuitous happening by accident. I think it's important to then engineer those circumstances. I wrote an article about this a few years back about serendipity engineering. Like, how can you actually intentionally create circumstances where random events can occur that create space for that serendipitous innovation to occur? One approach that we took with one team was we arranged for a regular coffee break. Different people had a different tolerance for the frequency. In the end, it ended up being once a week on a Wednesday afternoon for an hour. And it was just an opportunity for everyone in the teams to come together and just sit down and have a cup of coffee, because you don't hang out in the lunch hall anymore. You don't hang out having a cup of coffee anymore. You don't bump into each other in the car park and have a conversation while you walk into the office. Those things just weren't happening. So we tried to create a circumstance where that specific type of thing could occur. Another thing that I do with teams is I encourage them to have an open door policy. So, I ideally, so what we have on Slack is we have links to the different rooms that we might have open for certain things, and we make sure that people know where we are. In Tuple, of course, you've got a number of different rooms. You can see who's in what room. So if you need to speak to someone, you can just drop in, say hello. Obviously, if people are pairing, you'll drop in, be respectful, wait patiently for them to come to a natural point in which they can stop doing what they're doing, and then say, they'll say, hey, Antony, how are you? I'm like, I'm good. I just thought I'd drop in. How's it going? Oh, yeah, great. Did you want something? Yeah, actually, I did. I really need to ask you a question. And then we have that quick conversation and then move off, just like you can when you can walk over to someone's desk and wait for a moment, and then someone can then speak to you just kind of in the moment, rather than having to send a Slack message. Are you free? It's just a lot of back and forth. So we tend to operate an open door policy in that sense. And any of the teams that I coach, I really encourage it, because it's one of those things where when that does occur, I can drop into that room because I needed to catch somebody and talk to them about something. And I could notice that they're doing something that is solving a problem similar to one that I've had to solve, and I was stuck on it. And I've just seen how they've gone about solving it. So again, it's creating the opportunities for that serendipitous discovery to occur.
I
Without
really
you,
like this idea of engineering serendipity. Of course, it's a lot more practical than the phrase makes it sound, right? It's not science. It's just being mindful of where can people find each other, connect with each other without necessarily having to go and create a slot in the calendar, wait for it to happen, sit down and talk and then finish on time, right? Because there's a meeting before and there's a meeting after. And I think that that's a very important distinction. What have you learned from these experiments that you've run? What have you learned are kind of the conditions you need for that meeting to really be kind of, I guess, catalyst for serendipity?
first and most important thing is you really have to have a sense of safety within the team. That's the most important thing, because if I'm working with someone and a random other team member drops in, we need to feel completely safe in that situation, that they're not going to be judging us as they watch us work, or they don't need to feel concerned about dropping in and hearing us saying bad things about them. You need to have a really, really strong sense of psychological safety for it to work. But the outcomes of it that I've seen range from the examples I've given, helping people get unstuck much more quickly rather than having to wait until the stand up the next morning and talk about it. And in some of the teams I coach, those sorts of discoveries don't even happen in a stand up because they've become status updates. And one of the reasons I'm there is to help them stop doing status updates and share learnings and challenges and struggles. One of the first things I encourage people to do is stop using the word blocked, for example. It's like, no, the word impediment was there for a reason. I'm not into Scrum particularly, but I do think these words matter, because people won't speak up when they're being slowed down. They'll only speak up when things have completely grind to a halt. So, but those stand-ups, if you can get past them being status updates and actually be about sharing the experiences we've had in the last day and how that experience is informing what we're likely to encounter today, that can create opportunities for people to start exchanging knowledge, exchanging experiences. But it is once a day and it's brief. It's a real challenge. Another thing that we've seen happen from these types of situations, like one of the things that we have is time set aside after the stand up for a what we call tech chat, which is sharing anything that you've done in the last day that could be of interest, where you've solved a problem that was interesting or used a novel solution or want feedback on anything. And those tend to be quite free flowing conversations. And again, it helps you arrive at just an even better design, because even though two people might have been pairing for a day, you're now getting feedback quite quickly, and you've set aside time for everyone in the team to either learn from it or contribute to it. And then there's other circumstances where we've just come up with completely new ideas, because people were able to think of something that they maybe hadn't or wouldn't have thought of otherwise, and been able to come up with a completely new feature that was something that was not previously considered. So all of these things are possible. I mean, there are companies that Google famously set aside 20% time. I know there's the joke about it being 20% of a 100-hour week. I don't know how true that is or false that is, but that's the meme, at least. But great things have come from that. Gmail came from it. That was just a personal project that someone had, trying to solve the problem of not being able to find emails and having to file emails all the time, and not being able to discover the emails that they needed when they needed them, and leveraging the indexing capabilities of Google. So we can see what that grew into today. I mean, that's worth billions of dollars a year now, in terms of return. So it's worth it. And that's another thing that we do. Every other Friday, we set aside time just to work on personal projects. And we've got people working on everything, like you name it, from electronics projects to all sorts of other things.
So we've talked about serendipity as kind of a success factor for remote teams, right? Setting the serendipity moments up deliberately. What other success factors you have found really help remote software teams to succeed, to thrive in their work?
One thing that I think is pretty key is something that actually helps teams thrive, whether they're working co-located or remote, and that's just collaboration. like real collaboration. Again, I grew up, I suppose, on extreme programming, and things like pairing have been how I've worked for many, many years. And when software teaming or ensemble programming or mob programming, whichever term people like to use, came along, that again felt like a very natural way to work for me. So I think maintaining that ongoing collaboration is key. I think finding tools that allow you to interact as seamlessly as possible and as close to working in real life as possible, whether that's digital whiteboards, screen sharing, and interactive screen sharing tools. These are all quite important things, and I think the ability to kind of retain some of what was good about the good old days. The ability to just try and give someone a call. Don't spend lots of time sending messages waiting to hear back. Just give them a call. If they're free, they'll answer. If they're not, they'll reject the call. Having open room policies, these are key. But I think the number one thing that is key is it is really about like mental well-being. Some of us love our own company. I'm one of those people. I can spend lots of time on my own, and I'm very, very happy. I love spending time with people as well, but I can spend a lot of time on my own, so I'm actually okay. And during the period of time during that certain global event that sent everyone home, I was actually okay. Like I had a lot of friends who were struggling and they really found it hard, but I was okay. But because of that, I recognized that other people in the team might need that human interaction. They might need to talk to people, but also they might need a break. And that's one thing that I think is key. Making sure you set aside time for regular breaks, little and often, is much, much better than working solidly for 3 hours and then having a lunch break. No, 45 minutes to an hour, take at least 5 minutes, 5 to 10 minutes, 45 minutes to an hour, 5 to 10 minute break. If you do that, you can maintain your energy so much more throughout the day. And when, of course, you're working in, ensemble programming, the work continues whether you're there or not. And creating that environment and reminding everyone, especially if they're new to the team, from the start, if at any time you need a break, don't worry, step away, the work will continue. And when you come back, a part of you coming back is that you bring a fresh pair of eyes and you can ask the questions that might help us stop going down a rabbit hole that we probably shouldn't be going down. So those breaks are really, really valuable to the team, but they're also valuable to the individual in terms of maintaining their mental well-being. And of course, making sure you get out and go for walks and go for a bike ride. If you make your lunch at home, then you can, wake up in the morning, have your breakfast, you can be at your computer all day, then you make your lunch, and then you sit back at your computer, then you're just at home all day. Try and get out at lunchtime. I get out in the morning. Like every morning I do some sort of exercise, whether it's cycling, walking, running, and that sets me up for the day. Obviously, other people might prefer lunchtime, but just get outside, get some fresh air.
Even if it's raining, by the way.
Yeah, raining is it's really good.
Of course, you're in the UK. You would say that, wouldn't you?
That's why we have umbrellas.
Indeed, or wellies and rain covers. But of course, so thank you for sharing those tips. I think that especially the breaks and going outside are extremely important because our mental well-being depends on that. One of the other things that kind of affects remote teams is this ability to share information and make sure everybody's on the same page, right? Like, I mean, we all know Scrum has its own way of doing that, right? You have the backlog refinement, and then you have the sprint planning and so on. But how do you kind of shape these interactions to make sure everybody's on the same page? How do you shape these interactions for your remote teams, Antony? What have you heard really works well for remote teams?
Again, it's about setting aside time and treating that time as important and focused time. So if many of the teams that I work with, I tend not to try and encourage templated methodologies. I think they're a great source of ideas, but they're not necessarily where a team should start. And I'll always, when I'm coaching, start from where a team is today and then try to understand how we can move them forward. If I'm running a team where I've hired people into that team specifically, I might have a little bit more of a say into how that team starts working. But little and often I've found works very, very well. However, having a little time set aside to get an update on what the product direction is, what the focus is, that's key. I tend to have a bias towards few items of work in progress at any one time, a pull-based sort of Kanban style model where the work gets pulled and it gets done and there's no artificial time boxes around it. And that it so happens that the way I work and the teams of the people that I tend to hire can slice the work down into parts that are small enough and valuable and can be done in a few days. But you still want to know like the bigger picture, like why. Now, one thing that I've noticed about a lot of teams that I encounter is they'll often talk about a practice that they're using called user stories. And when I then experience what they have said are user stories, they rarely line up with my understanding of it.
Can you give us a concrete example of that contrast?
So, for example, normally what you'll have is one of two things. You'll either have a list of tasks that the team's doing, and there won't necessarily be any direct, obvious way to relate that to the product. Like, yeah, we can see that you're doing these tasks, but what's the result of that collection of tasks? Or there'll be features or parts of a feature. And this is the difficulty with this. So, for example, I'll use your typical login example, right? So, a login screen is just a feature. Okay, it's an attribute that the product might have. But what does the user actually want? Well, they want to make sure, let's say it's a social media site, they want to make sure that no one can pretend to be them. And there might be other ways that we can do it without using a login screen. We might use, a third-party identity service. We might use, biometrics. There are so many different ways that I can make sure that someone else can't pretend to be me. And that's the distinction. I actually have a course that I run around this. And one of the examples, in the course, you have to come up with some personas and you're going to create a home and you end up building it out of Lego and all these other things. And the first place I start is I get the team to actually write a backlog for this home. And inevitably, people think home, they think house, they think we've got to have the foundations, we've got to have the walls, we've got to have the windows, we've got to have the roof. The features of the house, attributes that the house has. One of the best examples I work with is people who talk about a garage. I'm like, okay, great. Pause. You've done that now. So I give them a short period of time, usually far too short a period of time to actually achieve anything. And they go try to build their garage. And then the time box ends and I say, okay, so what value have you delivered? And it's, oh, well, we've got the foundation for the garage. I'm like, what value have you delivered? And like, oh, well, that's a stepping stone towards thinking, yeah, but that might be value adding, but it's not valuable. There's a difference. So then I say, okay, what does the garage do for us? And why would we want one? And then people usually say, well, it's a place to put our car. Yeah, okay. And what's the benefit? Oh, lowers our insurance premiums. Great. Okay. So now if our car's on the road, do we have to have a garage to reduce our insurance premiums? And someone will usually say, well, no, we just need a driveway to start. I said, right, if we can give a driveway today, we can lower our insurance premiums immediately rather than waiting until we've built an entire garage. And then someone will say, well, the other thing it does is it shelters from the elements so you don't have to spend as much time washing your car. Great. Okay. Do we need a whole garage for that? And they're like, actually, no, you can have a carport with just 4 posts and a canopy. I'm like, okay, so now we can have a driveway immediately, premiums lowered. Now we can shelter it from the elements with a carport, much quicker to create than a garage. What else do you want the garage for? to keep the vehicle more secure. Can we keep it secure in other ways? Yes, we can put a bollard so that people can't drive the car out. So there's so many small little things that we can do. If you think about what's the problem we're trying to solve for the user and why, and what's the value to them, rather than what product does somebody else have in mind? How have they broken that product down into its various attributes? And then what tasks do I need to do to build the thing they have in mind, which might not even be the right product? We might get to the carport with the bollard and the customer might say, actually, that's enough for now. I've got more important things that we could be working on.
Yeah, I really love that example. And it so beautifully illustrates the idea of incrementally delivering value that so often gets forgotten in our conversations. Really great example. All right, we're getting close to the end, Antony, but I didn't want to end before asking you, like looking ahead, you've got a lot of experience working with software teams. And of course, since Corona hit, also working with remote software teams. How do you see remote work evolving for software teams specifically? What are some of the trends you've witnessed and want to highlight for us?
Well, I think one of the trends that I notice is people struggling with the tools that they have rather than thinking outside the box and considering, is there something better out there? I don't want it to sound like a plug for Tuple, but at the end of the day, if you're struggling with a passive video conferencing tool and you can't interact with each other's screens, I think that's a massive limitation. So a negative trend is people just struggling with the tools that they have. I think in the sort of near term, one of the things that I've been spending a little bit of time experimenting with is virtual reality. So, there's a product called Immersed where it runs on the Meta Quest 3, which I have, and on eVision Pro. And you can essentially create your virtual screens. You can choose to work in a coffee shop. And this goes back to my point about creating serendipitous encounters. You can work in a coffee shop. You can have your microphone on so that you can actually say hello to people, find out what they're working on, all entirely in a virtual world. And I think there's potential for that to work. I think we need slightly better resolution and slightly lower weight headsets. Immersed themselves happen to have one of those. I think that they're planning to release at some point, which is designed specifically for work. But I think that's an area that's going to explode. I found I can only work with the headset on for relatively short periods, like 45 minutes or so. Your head gets quite hot. It's quite heavy by comparison. But once the form factor reduces to a small enough and light enough to wear like a pair of glasses, and once the resolution of the actual screens and the quality of the lenses improves, I think that could be a very interesting way to start bringing back some of what we lost with co-location, some of those serendipitous encounters that might occur. I also think that we can't ignore the elephant in the room, which is AI. Yes, to some extent, it's a bit of a buzzword, but it's already playing a part in our coding experiences. The IDE is giving us suggestions of how to fill in that method based on what it thinks we might be trying to do at that moment in time. You can write a comment to say what you want it to do, and it will try and fill it in. What I'm waiting for, and I haven't seen it yet, but if I can make the time, this will be one of my personal projects, is actually to be able to write a test and for the AI to then figure out, well, what code do I need to change to make only that test pass with the ones from before. So, if I write the test, you can write the implementation code and then maybe suggest refactorings and try and help me find my way to a cleaner code base. I think that's an inevitable step forward. However, if you think about the opportunities that we have, what's to say that we couldn't have an AI participant that joins us and can talk and verbalize ideas and suggestions of how we could solve a particular problem. And then you could actually say, I'm not sure what you mean. Could you show me? And they can actually take over and start typing. For many of us, that might sound far-fetched, but I don't think it's that far away based on the technology we currently have. You can talk to Chat GPT and it can talk back to you with human intonation and breaths and pauses and ums and ahs.
Yeah.
It can suggest code in the IDE. Why can't it suggest a verbalized version of that solution to the person who happens to be typing? Of course, the natural evolution of that is that eventually you won't need us at all. But for now, and certainly I think for the rest of my career, I'm old enough for it to be for the majority of the rest of my career. I don't think that's going to be the case. But I think there are opportunities in that area. One concern I have about a common trend in anything is convergence, where tools start out doing one thing really, really, really well, and then they get to a point where, well, they're kind of minor enhancements with marginal gains, and they can't really expand their market share anymore. So then they decide, right, we're going to expand our tool to do more, and then more, and then more, and more, and it becomes this bloatware where it still kind of does the original thing pretty well, but it now does a whole load of other things not very well. And one of the things I really prefer to see with tooling is integrations. So like give me integration so I can use the individual tools that are highly specialized and are those tools that have really worked hard at being really good at what they do, and allow me to use those in an integral way rather than trying to sort of bloat applications out into becoming a video conferencing tool and a whiteboarding tool and
and a doc editor and a calendar and an email client and so hello Zoom, why are you doing this? Yeah, you can totally see that. Of course, that's also the ethos of the good old Unix systems, right? Like small little utilities that you can pipe and then get a lot more complex behavior from. So Antony, we're getting close to the end, but there's a lot of people listening to us that are right now working in remote software development teams, and they want to hear from you. Where else can I go and learn more about how to make or help my remote software development team work?
This is an interesting question. Now, there are books out there about remote work, but they tend to be quite generalized, not so much about specifics of software development. I do think has its unique set of challenges, because we are doing quite work that is involving quite deep thoughts, but it's also highly collaborative if you're working in a sort of XP, extreme programming style with pairing and ensemble programming. I haven't seen anything that really talks to that a great deal yet. I also looked around for a while, looking at various articles that you'd find in your usual business journals, and for the vast majority of them, it was all common sense stuff. I mentioned things like taking breaks and that sort of thing, and making sure you have regular check-ins with everybody and so on. But then some of them were disturbingly kind of micromanagey and all about how, rather than trusting your team, it was all about how you can get more visibility of what people are doing to make sure they're actually working. And it's like, if you're trying to solve that problem, actually that's not your real problem. Your problem is how you set your team up and the culture that you've created. You need to be able to trust people to get the work done and to do the work. But I have genuinely found it a bit of a struggle to find any resources that I would say, yeah, I could recommend that would be great. So I don't know, have you found any that you thought were particularly good?
So specifically for software developers, I haven't. And that's actually why I wanted to also have you kind of phrase your experience as, looking for these things and trying to figure out how to make this work for software development. And of course, we've talked about Tuple and other tools that make the remote pairing and remote ensemble programming easier. So that's something to look at for sure. But when you talk about this aspect that we are in a type of work that is both requiring a lot of deep thought as well as high levels of collaboration, right? And we need both sides. I think we also have to recognize that we probably just need to run a lot of experiments and share that with the community like you just did with us today, because we might be doing this for the first time if you consider, the wider industry out there.
Yes, absolutely. So maybe I should do more of that, share more of the things that we try and experiment with.
And if you want to come back to the podcast with some of your team members and kind of do a first person storytelling account of how you made it work in a specific project, I would be happy to host you again.
and I'd be happy to discuss that possibility for sure. There's a couple of things I think I probably would like to then maybe mention for the benefit of anyone who is hoping to look for some tips, if you like, to make it successful. I've mentioned things like looking after mental well-being, taking breaks, etc. I mentioned don't just accept the tooling you have. Look out there to see what there is and experiment, try things to see if it works. One of the things I didn't mention is that, when you are either pairing or in an ensemble, I think one of the really important things to do, even if the tooling you have allows the person to interact with your screen, um, if you're connected to my screen, I would call me the host. I'm hosting this particular session. Rotate who the host is on a regular basis, because there's two real significant benefits to that. One, when everyone's on your computer, you can't do anything else. You've got to be completely 100% focused. Sometimes you just want to go and quickly look something up, but you want to allow the work to continue. And that can't happen at the moment. You have to do that on a separate device. Whereas if you're, and the fact that you can't do that can be quite tiring. Like, you have to use a lot of patience and consideration for people. And you have to be slightly more considerate, just like hosting anything, a house party, a dinner party, or a pair programming session. If you're hosting, you have to give it a little bit more patience, and that takes a little bit of a toll after a while. So if you rotate who the host is on a regular basis, that's good. And one of the things that I've done recently when I was pairing with some Android developers, I said, well, in fact, there was three of us. We were in an ensemble. I said, what we'll do is we'll ping pong on the screen, but when it's time to write the next failing test, we'll commit push and rotate who the host is. And we were rotating on average about 10 to 15 minutes. And it was fast, it was dynamic, and it felt actually quite natural. So we had the benefit of, being able to gesture on the screen with our labeled mouse pointer and say, no, this part here. And if they said, oh, I'm not sure, you could just chip in and say, I think something like this. What do you think? And you could type on the screen there and then, but they're still the main driver. But then you rotate, and then that kind of has a tendency to rotate who the driver is as well at that point. So doing that on a frequent basis is important, but it doesn't just kind of help keep you engaged and motivated and reduce the fatigue. It also reveals certain issues like, oh, I forgot to commit that one new file that we created. Yeah. And because we rotated within 10 to 15 minutes, we discover that I've forgotten to commit that. And because it doesn't work on that other person's machine. And we know exactly what we did in the last 10 to 15 minutes. So we can fix that problem really, really quickly. So little things like that, there's always a time when you just accidentally miss that one file, or there's a new environment variable that you've introduced.
Or forgot to exclude some other file that then got committed, and you go like, why isn't this working?
Exactly. So rotating the host on a frequent basis is important. And then for clarification, where I was talking about the user stories, understanding the why, what's the point, what's the problem we're trying to solve is important. But understanding the bigger picture, the bigger why is key too. And setting aside dedicated time to work with the product manager or product owner, whatever the key role is in who has the greatest knowledge of that, setting aside time at least once a week to have a conversation about, right, here's what we've been working on. Here's what we know is next. What's the future look like? What does that roadmap, how has it evolved? Because it's continuously evolving as we learn more. Setting aside that time, at least on a weekly basis, is key. And finally, the second most important thing to do after looking after your mental well-being is retrospectives. Like, do retrospectives regularly. Like, if anyone said to me, if you could pick any one named agile practice, and that's the only one that a team was allowed to use at the beginning, retrospectives. Because as long as you're reflecting and adapting and making changes, you can literally reinvent all of the good practices that have come before just by solving the problems and the challenges that you have week to week. I've literally seen that with a team. I was coaching a team years ago, and I was told that their team leader was completely against anything agile, anything XP. Don't mention those words, but they really need some help. The rest of the team's open, but this one person isn't. And I said, well, let's just introduce retrospectives and let's start from there. Let's just reflect on how things are going on a fortnightly basis and literally that team over the course of 18 months pretty much reinvented test-driven development, both the inner loop and the outer loop. Some people might call that BDD, whatever you prefer. And a number of other practices. Even the concept of user stories, they pretty much reinvented it simply by saying, well, look, we're implementing this stuff. We don't know why we're doing it. What's the problem? We might have a better idea. But why don't we just find out? Get the users to tell us, what's their challenge this week. And we managed to speak to a user and they told us their story and found out what was really affecting them. And they were like, oh, well, we could solve that in these 3 different ways. Let's try this one to begin with. They literally reinvented these ideas over this period of 18 months just by reflecting on the problems they were facing, picking the ones that they had the most passion and interest to do something about, and trying something new every time.
Yeah, I'm totally with you on that. Just start with retrospectives. That's an awesome place to start. All right, Antony, we're getting close to the end. But before we go, where can people find out more about you and the work that you're doing?
Well, a while back, there was this thing called Twitter that was actually a pretty good place for tech people to be. And I used to spend a lot of time there. I'm still kind of there, but not as much. And these days, you can find me on LinkedIn. Hopefully, you can leave a link to my LinkedIn in the session notes. Antony Marcano. Anyone who's looking for me, don't use H in Antony. That's a common mistake. There's no H in my Antony. And LinkedIn is probably where I post a lot of what I'm doing with either RiverGlide or for digital, or some of the other things that I do in the motorsport space with Driven by Diversity. That's probably the number one place to look. Or you can check out riverglide.com, have a read of the blog from the blog link there. Some of the ideas I've talked about today are in those articles. I haven't written anything on there for a while, if I'm honest. But I find myself often reusing many of the articles. They haven't needed to be updated for quite some time, which is useful but sad. And I've also got a few videos. Anytime I appear on in a conference talk that's published to YouTube, I have a playlist on RiverGlide TV on YouTube, and I've got a few little videos, talks, and interviews where people can learn a bit more about my mindset and my thought process and my experiences there.
Absolutely. We'll put the link to all of those in the show notes so that people can easily find you. And of course, why not ask a few follow-up questions on LinkedIn. Antony, it's been a pleasure. Thank you very much for your generosity with your time and your knowledge.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure to talk to you.
Hey there. We hope you loved the episode. And before you go, don't forget to thank the folks at Tuple.app for being so generous with their stories and for their support for the podcast. So visit their website at tuple.app/Scrum, get their discount, and why not share them with your colleagues if you find that the app is useful. And remember, sharing is caring.